So today we're going to talk about anxiety and ways to counteract it that we find in the practices of early Buddhism. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you stick around to the end, I'll have a really fun video that deals with the topic of anxiety by a great young filmmaker. So in a video of mine about loving kindness, I got a comment from Afanasy Bushmanov, who mentioned the fact that he had issues with anxiety in his life, and he found that his practice of mindfulness and calming meditation was very helpful to him, or could be helpful to him, rather than loving kindness in particular. And I think we can all understand how practice of mindfulness can be helpful to reducing anxiety just by making us aware of it, by making us aware perhaps that things are in the present not exactly as anxiety-provoking as we might expect. And certainly calming meditation can help simply by calming us down, and so making us less reactive in that sense. And anxiety, I think we should remember, is it's a chronic kind of low-grade fear that sticks with us all the time. And it can be very debilitating if we don't deal with it. Anxiety is a kind of stress. And I did a recent video about stress, which I'll link up here. We should definitely focus on that because stress is something that we really, as much as possible, should try to reduce in our lives, particularly the chronic kind of stress, the chronic kind of anxiety. And to that end, in this video I'm going to be talking about some practices that we find in early Buddhism, and there are going to be practices in other kinds of related philosophies, say Stoicism, other kinds of Greek and Roman philosophies, other philosophies around the world, that are going to be probably similar in certain respects to what I'm talking about today. But we're not talking about the most profound and deep kind of chronic anxiety, because if it's something that's really debilitating, it's probably something that you're going to want to talk to a professional about, that is a doctor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist. I did another video on the difference between psychotherapy and Buddhist practice that I'll put here up here on the screen, because I think it's important to keep that in mind. That is, this kind of practice is going to be useful for moderate to mild anxiety, and, you know, the kind of thing that we might have from time to time in our daily life, a kind of a chronic but low-grade anxiety that comes and goes, but that isn't really debilitating. And so to that end, one of the reasons that I really kind of found Afanasy Bushmanov's comment interesting is because, in fact, in the early texts, when the issue of anxiety comes up, I would say more than anything, it's loving kindness that's the practice that's recommended. Anxiety isn't a big topic in the early texts. Fear comes up now and then. We'll talk about that. Loving kindness in early Buddhism, in most cases, was a relatively thinly described kind of practice, where you were just trying to bring up in yourself an emotion of kindness, of friendliness towards the world, and broadcast it out in certain directions. But also, one of the most famous suttas in the early texts is one called the Metta Sutta, or the Sutta on Loving Kindness. And in that one, we get a more thickly described kind of mental operations we're sort of supposed to go through, where we're supposed to extend friendliness, extend good feelings, extend a wish for happiness towards different parts of the world, different kind of people, different kind of creatures, and eventually to everyone without exception. So the Metta Sutta is one place we find these kinds of practices. There's another place in the early suttas, in a sutta called Snakes, which is one that Andy Olendzki, the scholar of early Buddhism, believes may actually predate Buddhism and may be a kind of a pre-Buddhist snake charm. In other words, within India at that time, of course, there were poisonous snakes around, dangerous snakes, and people were obviously afraid of them and didn't want to get bitten. And so one of the strategies that people would use is a kind of a magical strategy of certain kinds of snake charms, of having something that one kept in mind, one could say perhaps, to make the snake calm down and go away. And so what we find in this particular sutta is basically a carbon copy of the Metta Sutta in certain respects. In other words, what it's trying to do is to get us to cultivate a mind of friendliness, a mind of loving kindness towards snakes, towards certain kinds of snakes, all kinds of snakes, in the expectation and hope that that will make them go away and not bother us and obviously not bite us. And clearly there's an element of magic to this. The idea that by making arise certain kinds of feelings in us, we may change parts of the world. But there's also, and I think more importantly, a kind of a psychology to this, where snakes most of the time are not going to be dangerous. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to counteract our own fear or our own anxiety. And also, clearly there's a part of it which may actually be useful in the sense that if we're less anxious, if we're less reactive towards animals, in particular snakes in this case, we're going to make it perhaps less likely that they get aggressive towards us. Because if we're less anxious around them and less reactive, maybe we'll move more slowly, we'll move with more apparent kindness in ways that don't seem threatening to the snake. So we can understand that there's many, many levels on which this kind of a quote-unquote snake charm might be useful, even if we put to one side the potential magical claims that one might make of it. But to get to metta in particular, there are commentaries to both the Metta Sutta and to one particular passage in the Dhammapada, which have a similar kind of story to them. And in this story, what we have are a group of monks that the Buddha told to go rather far away, actually, from where he was staying, off to some place in the mountains to spend a good significant amount of time meditating. And part of that meditation would have been meditation at night, because that was a normal thing that monastics would do. And it appears, at least the description that we have in the commentaries, is that when these monastics were out at night in the forest meditating, they claimed they were harassed by forest deities, certain kinds of supernatural creatures of the forest that caused to arise very fearful kinds of sights and sounds and smells. The monks couldn't meditate properly because they were scared all the time. This commentarial material may reflect back on an earlier sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 4, the Bhayabhairava Sutta, or the Sutta on fear and dread, where the Buddha talks about his own history, and in particular his history before he became awakened. And the fact that when he was in the forest at night, as a bodhisattva, that is to say a person who was looking for awakening but not yet awakened, he was also often terrorized by these kinds of night fears. In the same way I think any of us would be. It's a very human thing to have happen to us in a forest at night where we can't see anything clearly. Any sound that we hear is amplified in our mind and made to seem terrible and potentially life-threatening, where any weird smell might make us think of a bear or some kind of large creature out to get us. So we can understand that, and the Buddha himself talks about having to basically in meditation kind of fight these urges towards fear simply by really, in his case, it seems like sort of sheer force of will, that he would just keep doing the same thing he was doing until that kind of fear went away. But so in this case, which would have been potentially many years later, even if we assume that this commentarial tradition goes back to the historical Buddha, it might not. But even if we assume that, this would have been many, many, many years later, when he had a large sangha, when he was telling monks where to go. And at this point, we can imagine that he would have a good deal of a deeper understanding of this kind of fear and how it might arise. So in any event, the monks came back in the story a long distance to go back to the Buddha and ask him, please give us a different place to meditate, because in this place that you've told us before, there are these forest deities that are making us afraid. So maybe if you pick a better location without forest deities, we can meditate in calm at night and won't have any problem. And the Buddha told them to go back to the same place. He said, I don't want you to go anywhere else. I want you to go to the same place. But this time, I want you to keep in mind the Metta Sutta and to use it as what he called a protective discourse. A discourse to keep in mind to protect them from these forest deities. He recommended for them both to use it in the sense of reciting it to themselves at night, but also in the sense of meditating upon the content of the sutta. That is, to meditate upon the whole notion of loving kindness, of kindness towards all things, of kindness that's indiscriminate. I think that the Metta Sutta is pretty clearly intended, at least partially, to be a kind of a psychological balm towards assuaging this kind of chronic anxiety, or anxiety that comes up and stays with us for long periods of time, without any obvious kind of trigger. Now, they will say that, the commentary says that the trigger was these forest spirits, but that's, I think, at least we can say with a modern eye looking back that oftentimes these kinds of generalized anxieties were attributed to supernatural beings like spirits or other kinds of supernatural entities because they didn't seem to have any other source. And to that end, in another sutta called the Spear, in Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha talks about loving kindness as being a way of strengthening your mind, so that it will not be, as he says, overthrown or overtaken or possessed by supernatural or non-human beings. And he says that the practice of loving kindness will make your mind like a spear, in the sense that a metal spear cannot be bent easily with one hand. It can't be bent at all. In the same way that your mind cannot, when it's been liberated with this loving kindness practice, cannot be bent to the will of a supernatural being. And I think in particular what this aims at is that you can't be made to be afraid. You can't be made to run away. You can't be made to stop doing what you want to do because of fear of these supernatural beings. Or, we might say with a more modern take, you won't be assuaged by anxiety and fear that seems to have no basis. We won't be assailed by chronic anxieties. That is to say, loving kindness provides confidence, because we don't feel as though we're in a position of antagonism towards the world. If we feel that we're in a place of antagonism, that we're not prone to be kind to other things or other beings or other people, then it puts us in a different stance, in a stance of fight or flight, in a stance of stress and anxiety. But if we begin with a sort of a psychology, a mind of kindness, then that goes away and it's replaced by confidence. So in this respect, we can see that loving kindness isn't simply an antidote towards anger and hatred, which is certainly, it's probably its main antidote, but it's also an antidote towards anxiety and fear. And just as a bit of fun here, Dan Mace, a really great young YouTube filmmaker and a friend of Casey Neistat's, has a recent video that he made about anxiety, about his own struggles with anxiety. His video take on it is really, I think, fantastic and gets up close, not only to the anxiety itself, but to his own ways of breaking through it with his own kind of confidence. And so I'll put a link up to that video on the screen here if you want to watch that. I think it's a lot of fun. So if you have any questions about this practice or any of these practices, please feel free to put them down below in the questions and comments. I always love to read your questions and your comments. I think they're both really useful to me, and I'm sure to other people who watch these videos. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll catch you on the next go-around. So meanwhile, be well and be without anxiety.